In 1989, a teenager walked into a Connecticut police station and never walked out a free man. Ricky Birch was just 17 when he was accused of a brutal murder he swore he didn't commit. The evidence? Circumstantial. The testimony? Not just flawed, but scientifically bankrupt. Here's the part that will make your blood run cold. The so-called irrefutable science used to convict him? It was complete junk. And the world-famous expert the jury trusted? Catastrophically wrong. This is the story of a boy condemned to die in prison and the 3-decade fight to prove a terrible mistake. How does a system so desperate for a conviction steal 35 years of an innocent man's life? And what discovery finally shattered the lies and set him free? Stay with us until the very last second, because the truth behind this case will shake your faith in the justice system to its core. Before we begin, make sure you're part of this journey. Hit subscribe, smash that like, and click the notification bell so you never miss the stories Innocence Uncovered is bringing to light. Tonight, we expose the story of Ricky Birch. December 1st, 1985, New Milford, Connecticut, a quiet town of rolling hills, tree-lined streets, and the kind of stillness that made people feel safe. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors greeted one another by name, and where crime was little more than an occasional shoplifting case or teenage joyride. But on this night, New Milford's sense of safety would be ripped apart. Inside a modest 2-story home on Aspetuck Ridge Road, a man named Everett Carr was settling in for the evening. 65 years old, a father, a grandfather, a man known for his steadiness and warmth. He was the type of neighbor people described as solid, dependable, someone you could borrow a tool from and know it would be returned polished the next day. Everett Carr lived a life of routine, and routine, in small-town America, is the foundation of comfort. But that comfort was about to be shattered in the most violent way possible. The next morning, Carr's daughter arrived to check in on him. From the moment she stepped through the front door, she knew something was horribly wrong. The house was in chaos. Chairs overturned, furniture knocked out of place, dark smears on the carpet. And then, in the living room, she found him. Everett Carr's body lay sprawled on the floor, his clothes soaked through with blood. He had been stabbed 27 times. The brutality was shocking. Not a quick attack, but a frenzy. His throat slashed, defensive wounds covering his hands and arms. He had fought desperately for his life. Police were called immediately. When the first officers stepped inside, they froze at the horror. Blood on the walls, blood on the furniture, a trail of crimson marking Everett's final struggle. One officer would later admit, "It was one of the most gruesome crime scenes I had ever witnessed." Whoever did this didn't just want him dead. They wanted him destroyed. Detectives began combing the house, trying to make sense of the scene. It was clear that this had not been a clean or calculated crime. Whoever had killed Everett Carr had left behind a storm of evidence. There were bloody shoe prints across the floor, fingerprints on surfaces, hairs that clearly did not belong to Everett or anyone in his family. A towel with a dark smear across it. In theory, this should have been a goldmine of leads. But in 1985, forensic science was still developing. DNA analysis wasn't yet available to local police departments. And so, instead of answers, the physical evidence only added more mystery. News of the murder spread quickly. New Milford wasn't used to bloodshed, let alone a savage killing like this. The front page of the local paper read, "Brutal murder rocks New Milford." Neighbors whispered about the crime. Parents clutched their children closer. For the first time in decades, doors were locked at night. The idea that someone could storm into a man's home, kill him so savagely, and then vanish into the night was almost too much to bear. The pressure on police was immediate. They needed answers. They needed a suspect. They needed to restore a sense of safety before panic consumed the town. Behind closed doors, the police department felt the weight of the town's fear. Reporters called daily. The family demanded justice. Politicians quietly pressed the chief. How can you let a killer walk free? But detectives had no clear suspect, no motive, no weapon. And in the absence of hard evidence, desperation set in. That desperation would soon lead them to make a fateful choice, one that would alter the lives of two teenagers forever. Within days, police began hearing rumors. Two local teenagers, Ricky Birch, 18, and Sean Henning, 17, were drifting through the area. They had reputations: petty crime, car thefts, breaking into houses for food or money. Troubled kids, both of them. Homeless at times, couch surfing, sometimes sleeping in stolen cars. They were easy to dislike, easy to suspect, and most importantly, they were outsiders. In the eyes of the community, Birch and Henning were already guilty of something. Why not this? Detectives brought them in for questioning. What were you doing the night of December 1st? Both Birch and Henning insisted they were nowhere near Carr's house. They admitted to stealing cars in the area, but denied murder. They repeated it again and again. We didn't kill anyone. But the detectives didn't buy it. They saw two young men with records, with no alibi, living on the fringes of society. To them, it was enough. Slowly, the theory took shape. Birch and Henning had broken into Carr's house to rob him. The crime went wrong. Carr resisted. They panicked and stabbed him again and again. It was a story that fit the fear of the community, a story that fit the pressure the police were under. The only problem? It didn't fit the evidence. The bloody footprints at the scene? Not Birch's, not Henning's. The fingerprints? Not theirs. The hairs and fibers? None matched. Even the towel with the supposed blood smear, the one later claimed to be crucial forensic evidence, wasn't tested properly at the time. Still, the investigators pushed forward. They convinced themselves they had the right men. And once the machinery of prosecution begins, it rarely stops, even when the evidence doesn't add up. As the investigation dragged on, the town's fear hardened into anger. People wanted someone to blame. Parents whispered, "It must have been those boys." Reporters framed Birch and Henning as dangerous delinquents. The town was primed for conviction before the trial even began. In the end, the murder of Everett Carr was more than just a tragedy. It became the foundation of a wrongful conviction. The town's fear, the police's desperation, and the narrative of two teenage outcasts created the perfect storm. A storm that would sweep Birch and Henning into a prison cell for crimes they did not commit. And yet, even as the public rallied around the arrests, one haunting question remained unanswered. If Ricky Birch and Sean Henning didn't kill Everett Carr, then who did? That question would echo for decades. And the truth, or lack of it, would expose deep flaws in the very system meant to protect the innocent. To understand how Ricky Birch and Sean Henning became the center of a murder investigation, you first need to understand who they were. In the mid-1980s, both were teenagers on the margins of society. Not hardened criminals, not killers, but kids who had slipped through the cracks. Ricky Birch was 18, tall, thin, restless. He grew up in a working-class family, but things at home were far from stable. By his teenage years, Ricky was adrift, skipping school, falling into petty crime, running with the wrong crowd. His life was a series of short-term hustles and bad decisions. Sean Henning, 17, was even more fragile. Smaller, wiry, with dark eyes that always seemed to be calculating. He had bounced from foster homes to relatives' couches, never really belonging anywhere. His record included car thefts and break-ins, survival crimes more than anything else. Together, Birch and Henning were partners in drifting. They stole cars not for thrill alone, but for a roof, for warmth, for food. In New Milford, they were known as those kids. Trouble, but not killers. But when a brutal murder shook the town, their reputations made them easy prey. In the days after Everett Carr's murder, investigators were desperate. Forensic evidence had failed to give them a clear suspect. The trail was cold before it even began. Then came a tip, or rather, a rumor. Someone told police that Birch and Henning had been seen joyriding in the area around the time of the murder. Another claimed the pair had bragged about breaking into homes. None of this tied them directly to Carr's murder. But in an atmosphere of fear and urgency, the leap from car theft to violent homicide felt smaller than it should have. Detectives seized on the idea. Here were two troubled teens, two outsiders, two names they could pin to the crime. It was, in many ways, the path of least resistance. On a cold December evening, Birch and Henning were hauled into the police station. The interrogation rooms were bare, harshly lit. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. On the walls, faded posters warned against drugs and urged silence in the waiting area. Detectives leaned in close across the metal table. "We know you were there. Just tell us what happened, and it'll go easier for you." But both Birch and Henning denied everything. They admitted to stealing cars that night. Yes, they had driven through the area. But no, they never went near Carr's house. They had never met him. They had no reason to kill him. The detectives weren't satisfied. Hours stretched on. The questions grew sharper, the tone more accusatory. "Your fingerprints were at the scene." A lie. None of the fingerprints matched. "Your shoes left prints in the blood." Another lie. The prints were from different shoes entirely. But the detectives weren't interested in inconsistencies. They wanted confessions, or at least slips of the tongue. When Birch and Henning refused to confess, investigators turned to another weapon: jailhouse informants. Weeks later, a man already facing charges claimed that Ricky Birch had confessed to him while in custody. He said Birch bragged about breaking into Carr's home and about how things got out of control. It was a classic informant tactic, offering prosecutors a neat story in exchange for leniency in their own cases. But there was no recording, no corroboration, just the word of a man with everything to gain. Still, prosecutors treated it as gold. In court, an informant's story, no matter how flimsy, can sound convincing when framed by authority. What made the focus on Birch and Henning so dangerous was how much evidence pointed away from them. The footprints at the scene were from sneakers far larger than either teen wore. The fingerprints collected didn't belong to them. The towel smear later tested negative for their DNA. No blood from the crime scene was found on their clothes, their shoes, or the car they had stolen that night. Think about that. A man was stabbed 27 times. Blood spattered across the walls, pooled on the carpet. The killer would have been drenched. Yet Birch and Henning had no trace of blood on them, in their belongings, or in the stolen car. It should have cleared them. But in a system more concerned with closure than truth, it was overlooked. Meanwhile, the community was growing restless. The image of two young drifters, already branded as criminals, fed into a narrative people wanted to believe. They were always bad news. You could tell they'd end up in prison someday. It makes sense. Who else would do something like this? It didn't matter that the evidence didn't match. The town was convinced. And the police, under pressure, leaned into that conviction. By 1989, for years after the murder, prosecutors officially charged Ricky Birch and Sean Henning with the murder of Everett Carr. The delay wasn't because they were building a strong case. It was because they were struggling to make the weak one they had hold together. Their argument was simple. Birch and Henning broke into Carr's home to rob him. When Carr caught them, they killed him in a frenzy. But as the trial approached, it became clear that the prosecution's case would rely less on evidence and more on emotion, on fear, and on the portrayal of two teenagers as monsters. For Ricky Birch and Sean Henning, the trial was not a search for truth. It was a performance. They walked into court already condemned in the eyes of their community. The jury would not see two scared teenagers. They would see killers. And yet, behind the scenes, one glaring fact remained. The real killer of Everett Carr was still out there. But in New Milford, justice wasn't about finding the real killer anymore. It was about giving the town someone to blame. And Birch and Henning were the perfect targets. By the spring of 1989, for years after the brutal murder of Everett Carr, the stage was set. The Litchfield Superior Court in Connecticut loomed as a symbol of justice. But for Ricky Birch and Sean Henning, it was more like a trap. Each morning, the courtroom filled with townspeople, reporters, and Everett Carr's grieving relatives. The atmosphere was thick with expectation. People wanted answers. They wanted closure. And more than anything, they wanted to see someone held accountable. The state was ready to provide them with a story. From the opening statements, prosecutors framed the case as a robbery gone wrong. They painted Ricky and Sean as violent drifters, teenagers spiraling out of control, who broke into Carr's home looking for money or valuables. When Carr confronted them, they claimed the boys panicked and stabbed him in a frenzy. It was a narrative that fit the community's fear. It didn't matter that no physical evidence tied them to the crime. What mattered was that the prosecution told a story people could believe. And in a courtroom, storytelling can be as powerful as truth. One by one, investigators and experts took the stand. Footprints. The bloody shoe prints found at the scene were shown to the jury. They were significantly larger than Birch's or Henning's shoe sizes. Instead of exonerating the teens, prosecutors brushed it aside, suggesting maybe the shoes were borrowed or stolen. Fingerprints. None matched Birch or Henning. But the jury heard little about that. Just that fingerprints were found at the scene, implying connection. Blood evidence. There was none. Despite the ferocity of the murder, not a single drop of Carr's blood was found on the boys' clothes, shoes, or in the stolen car they drove. The defense highlighted this. The prosecution countered with speculation. Maybe they had time to clean up. Maybe they disposed of evidence. Maybe became a weapon. Hair and DNA. The samples collected excluded the teens. But DNA science was new in 1989, still viewed with skepticism. The jury was told the tests were inconclusive, softening the blow of exculpatory evidence. Piece by piece, the prosecution twisted the gaps in evidence into shadows of guilt. Perhaps the most damning moment came when a jailhouse informant took the stand. He claimed that while in custody, Ricky Birch had confessed to him. He repeated a story of how Ricky described breaking into Carr's house, how things got out of hand, and how the killing happened. The informant's words dripped with details that had clearly come from police files rather than Birch himself. But to the jury, it sounded like a confession. The defense hammered at the man's credibility, pointing out that he was facing charges of his own, that he had everything to gain by cooperating. But juries often trust confessions, even secondhand ones. And in this case, it stuck. For the defense attorneys representing Birch and Henning, the trial was a nightmare. They had facts on their side. No blood, no fingerprints, no match on the footprints, no DNA. But they lacked the resources and influence of the state. When they tried to highlight the contradictions, prosecutors dismissed them as distractions. Of course there's no blood, they argued. These boys had time to change clothes, to clean themselves up. Of course the shoe prints don't match. Criminals don't always wear their own shoes. Every logical defense was met with speculation, and speculation proved more convincing than facts. Sitting in the jury box, 12 ordinary citizens were asked to decide between two competing narratives. On one side, a polished prosecution with a simple, emotionally gripping story. Two teens, a robbery, a violent murder. On the other, a struggling defense trying to untangle forensic contradictions, science that felt unfamiliar, and evidence that seemed too technical. The jurors saw Ricky and Sean sitting at the defense table, two poor, troubled kids who already looked guilty by stereotype. They weren't polished. They weren't well-dressed. They weren't sympathetic in the traditional sense. And in a small town, that mattered. In their closing arguments, prosecutors drove their point home. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not complicated. Two young men broke into a man's home. They thought they could take what they wanted, but Everett Carr surprised them. And in their panic, in their desperation, they killed him. Look at the crime scene. Look at the violence. It was frenzied. It was reckless. It was the act of two kids out of control. The defense countered with one final plea. There is not a single piece of physical evidence tying these boys to the crime. Not one. Their fingerprints are not there. Their hair is not there. The blood is not theirs. The shoe prints don't match. The prosecution asks you to convict on speculation, not fact. But speculation won. The jury deliberated for hours, then days. The weight of the decision pressed down on them. Some jurors were uneasy about the lack of evidence. Others pointed to the informant's testimony as enough. In the end, fear tipped the scales. In 1989, both Ricky Birch and Sean Henning were found guilty of felony murder. The courtroom erupted. Gasps from the public, quiet sobs from Carr's family, and stunned silence from the two boys whose lives had just been shattered. For Everett Carr's relatives, it felt like justice. For Birch and Henning, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The judge's words cut like stone. Ricky Birch was sentenced to 55 years in prison. Sean Henning was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The teenagers who had once drifted through life on the edges of society were now condemned to spend most of their lives behind bars. The gavel fell. The case was closed. The community exhaled in relief. The press declared victory. The system moved on. But beneath the surface, the truth was far from resolved. In a matter of weeks, two innocent young men had been transformed into convicted murderers. Despite the lack of physical evidence, despite the mismatched footprints, despite the DNA exclusions, the power of narrative had triumphed over the weight of truth. And so Ricky Birch and Sean Henning were sent away, carrying with them the burden of a crime they did not commit. But the question that haunted the town of New Milford, and still haunts it today, remained unanswered. If not them, then who really killed Everett Carr? In the winter of 1989, Ricky Birch and Sean Henning walked into prison as teenagers. By the time they would leave, decades later, they would be middle-aged men. The clang of the iron gates behind them was the sound of a life stolen. The world outside kept moving. Seasons changed, families aged, technology leapt forward. But for Ricky and Sean, time stood still. They had been branded killers. And in the brutal ecosystem of prison, that label meant danger, isolation, and endless fights for survival. Ricky Birch was sent to a maximum security facility, a place filled with men twice his size, many of them convicted of crimes he hadn't even imagined. He was only 18, wiry, unprepared. Within weeks, he had his first fight, not because he wanted to, but because prison demanded it. Respect was currency, and weakness was a death sentence. Sean Henning, younger and even more fragile, struggled differently. The loneliness crushed him. Nights were the worst, lying in a narrow bunk, staring at a ceiling that felt like a coffin lid. He wrote letters no one answered, replayed his trial in his head, wondering how it all went so wrong. Both boys grew into men behind concrete walls. Birthdays, holidays, milestones, all vanished into the sameness of prison life. But worse than the monotony was the injustice that gnawed at them every day. They weren't serving time for mistakes they made. They were serving time for a crime they hadn't committed. In prison, being labeled a murderer made them targets. Some inmates treated them with a twisted form of respect. Others saw them as rivals. Guards often treated them as irredeemable, less than human. But the deepest cut came when they looked inward. They knew who they were. Two kids who had stolen cars. Yes, but not killers. Yet no matter how many times they said it, the world outside refused to hear them. Their identities were stolen. Their voices silenced. Meanwhile, their families carried their own prison sentences. Ricky's mother never stopped visiting, even when money was tight and the bus ride hours long. She sat across from her son in the visiting room, separated by glass, pressing her hand against his as though she could still shield him from the world. Sean's relatives, weary of his troubled past, drifted in and out of his life. But he clung to whatever connection he could find, desperate not to be erased completely. Each visit ended the same way, the long walk back to the cell, the taste of freedom fading with every step. In the early years, their attorneys filed appeals. They argued the obvious: no blood, no fingerprints, no match to the crime scene. But the courts were unmoved. The conviction stood. Again and again, their pleas were rejected. Judges leaned on jury discretion, insisting the evidence had been fairly weighed. For Ricky and Sean, each denial was another stone piled on their backs. By the mid-1990s, it seemed their fate was sealed. Then came the rise of DNA technology. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science had advanced far beyond what it was in 1989. Now, labs could identify genetic profiles with precision that would have been unthinkable at the time of the trial. For Birch and Henning, this was a lifeline. Their legal teams filed motions to have the crime scene evidence retested. What came back was staggering. The DNA under Everett Carr's fingernails? Not theirs. The hairs at the scene? Not theirs. The blood evidence? Excluded them entirely. Piece by piece, science dismantled the case the prosecution had built. And yet, the state resisted. Prosecutors argued that the DNA didn't prove they weren't involved, just that someone else might have been there too. It was a maddening cycle. Even as proof of their innocence piled up, the system clung to its original verdict. In the early 2000s, a powerful new ally entered the fight: the Connecticut Innocence Project. Lawyers and investigators took a fresh look at the case. What they saw was shocking. The lack of physical evidence, the reliance on jailhouse informants, the leaps of logic at trial. It was a textbook wrongful conviction. The Innocence Project began filing motions, demanding not just DNA retesting, but a re-examination of the entire trial. They argued that Birch and Henning had been convicted not on evidence, but on fear, speculation, and prejudice. For the first time in years, Ricky and Sean had hope. But hope in prison was dangerous. It could lift you up one day and crush you the next. Ricky tried to stay strong, working in prison kitchens, reading legal books, mentoring younger inmates. He became a quiet leader, a man who carried himself with dignity despite his circumstances. Sean struggled more. Depression weighed on him. At times, he thought about giving up, resigning himself to dying behind bars. But every time, he reminded himself of the truth: I didn't do this. I can't let them bury me alive. Together, even when housed in separate facilities, they carried each other in spirit. Letters exchanged through prison mail became lifelines. As the Innocence Project pushed forward, journalists began taking notice. Newspapers published articles questioning the convictions. If not them, who? One headline asked. True crime shows highlighted the glaring inconsistencies. Slowly, public opinion began to shift. What once seemed like a closed case was now unraveling under scrutiny. And for Everett Carr's family, it raised painful questions. Had justice really been served, or had they been misled? The legal fight dragged on for years. Each motion for a new trial was met with resistance. Prosecutors argued that even without DNA, the jury had been justified. Courts stalled, hearings were delayed, files were lost or misfiled. For Birch and Henning, time stretched endlessly. Every victory was followed by another setback. But the truth was no longer hidden. With each passing year, the case for their innocence grew stronger. By the late 2010s, more than 30 years after their arrests, the tide finally began to turn. The Connecticut Supreme Court reviewed the case, focusing on the new DNA evidence. Their ruling was clear. The convictions of Ricky Birch and Sean Henning were no longer supported by evidence. The original trial had been deeply flawed. It was a landmark decision, one that opened the door to freedom. Inside prison, Ricky Birch received the news with a quiet nod. He had spent his entire adult life behind bars. Now, for the first time, there was light at the end of the tunnel. Sean Henning broke down in tears. Hope, the thing he had clung to through nights of despair, had finally materialized into reality. They were not free yet, but the cracks in the wall of injustice were spreading. The system that had once silenced them was finally being forced to listen. And the next chapter would decide whether two men who had lost decades could finally reclaim their lives. The courtroom was packed to the brim. Every seat filled, every eye fixed on the man who had walked into that chamber decades earlier as a teenager accused of murder. Now, gray streaks threaded through his hair, his face bearing the weathered lines of a life lived under fluorescent prison lights. Ricky Birch sat quietly at the defense table, his hands clasped together. His breathing was steady, but his chest rose and fell in sharp, measured movements. He was trying not to hope too much. After 35 years of disappointment, you learn to guard yourself against joy. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to speak. His words cut through the hushed silence. This court finds that the evidence originally presented was insufficient. The conviction of Richard Ricky Birch is hereby vacated. The gavel came down with a heavy crack that echoed like thunder. For a heartbeat, the room froze. No clapping, no shouts, just stunned silence. Ricky's eyes closed, and his lips trembled as tears forced their way down his cheeks. His attorney leaned over, whispered, "It's over. You're free." Behind him, his sister gasped, clutching her chest. Supporters began to cry. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. For Ricky, however, time had stopped. He was free, but his mind was replaying 35 years of bars slamming shut, of missed birthdays, of funerals he never got to attend. Walking out of the courthouse, Ricky raised his hand to shield his eyes from the glaring afternoon sun. The warmth on his skin felt almost foreign. For decades, the sun had been a faint, distant thing glimpsed only through narrow prison windows. The world had changed. Cars zipped by, sleeker and quieter than anything he remembered. People walked with glowing screens in their hands. Billboards flashed neon advertisements for brands he'd never heard of. A cluster of reporters crowded around him. Microphones pressed close. "Mr. Birch, how does it feel to be free? Do you have anything to say about the justice system? Are you angry?" He swallowed hard, his voice unsteady but resolute. "I've waited for this moment my whole life, but nothing can give me back what I lost." His words cut through the noise. Cameras flashed, capturing not just a man released, but a man forever altered. That evening, Ricky sat in his sister's living room. The walls were covered in family photographs, children he had only seen grow up through grainy prison visiting room glass. Now, those children were adults, hugging him, crying, telling him how much they had missed him. Dinner was served, real food, seasoned and rich, not the bland trays of prison. Ricky took a bite of roasted chicken and paused, savoring the taste. Tears streamed down his face. This tastes like home," he whispered. But joy was tangled with sorrow. He noticed an empty chair at the table, his mother's seat. She had died while he was inside. He never got to say goodbye. Later, alone in his room, he pulled out an old photo of her. "I'm free now, Mom. I did it. But I wish you were here." The weight of lost years pressed down. Freedom was sweet, but it carried a bitter aftertaste. Months later, Ricky's name was back in headlines across the country. Wrongfully convicted man wins $13 million settlement. The courtroom awarded him compensation for the decades stolen from him. To many, it was justice. To Ricky, it was symbolic, a recognition, but not restitution. In interviews, he explained, "Money can buy me a house, a car, clothes. But money can't give me back my youth. It can't give me back my mother. It can't erase the nights I cried myself to sleep in a cell, wondering if anyone would ever believe me." For viewers, this was the stark truth. Justice delayed is justice denied. The settlement was not a happy ending. It was an acknowledgement of an irreparable wound. One quiet morning, Ricky walked through the cemetery to his mother's grave, a bouquet of lilies in hand. He knelt and laid them gently against the headstone. His voice cracked as he spoke aloud. "I'm free now, Mom. I fought for the truth, and I won. But I wish you were here to hug me, to see me not behind glass, not in shackles, just me." He stayed there for hours, speaking softly to the stone, telling her about the cars, the phones, the strange new world. Passers-by might have thought him broken, but really, he was healing. The name Henry Lee, once revered as one of the most famous forensic scientists in America, now carried a bitter taste. Ricky's wrongful conviction was tied directly to Lee's testimony later deemed flawed and unreliable. News outlets dissected it. Law professors lectured about it. Lawmakers began to debate the reliability of forensic science in courtrooms. Ricky watched these debates with a quiet, detached expression. For him, this wasn't academic. It wasn't theory. It was his life. He was the face of what happens when truth is twisted, when experts fail, when courts choose conviction over justice. His case became a landmark example, a cautionary tale used in classrooms, seminars, and advocacy campaigns. He had become more than a man. He was a symbol. In time, Ricky began to speak publicly. Partnering with organizations like the Innocence Project, he toured schools, prisons, and community centers. Standing at podiums, his voice carried both authority and vulnerability. "Don't take freedom for granted," he told audiences. "I learned the hard way how precious it is. And never stop fighting for the truth, even when the world tells you to give up." Every story he told was a wound reopened, but also a scar displayed. The pain became his weapon, his testimony. Slowly, his suffering turned into purpose. Years later, Ricky stood at a family barbecue. The yard was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of grilled food. Children, nieces and nephews who had once visited him behind prison walls, now ran around freely, tugging at his sleeve, asking him to join their games. He smiled, watching them. For a moment, life felt whole again. The prison walls were gone. The fear was gone. Only the warmth of family remained. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, This is what they couldn't take away." Ricky Birch lost over 3 decades to a justice system that failed him. He entered prison as a teenager and emerged as a man who had missed nearly everything life had to offer. His story is one of suffering, resilience, and ultimately, vindication. But for every Ricky Birch who walks free, how many others remain locked away, innocent, waiting for someone to believe them? His exoneration is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a larger fight, a fight to ensure that truth, not flawed science, not assumptions, not fear, is what decides a person's fate. In the end, Ricky's life teaches us a painful truth. Freedom is priceless, and every stolen day is a debt that can never be repaid. Stories like Ricky Birch's remind us that justice can fail, and when it does, lives are shattered. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, don't let this be the last story you watch. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the truth behind America's most haunting wrongful convictions. Drop a like to push this story further, because the more people who see it, the harder it is for injustice to stay hidden. And share your thoughts below. How many more innocent people do you think are still waiting to be freed? Together, we're not just watching true crime, we're uncovering innocence.